Keynote. So we're now being live streamed, who are fantastic. It is a delight, it is a pleasure, it is a huge honor to introduce Cheryl Morgan. Cheryl is a writer, editor, publisher. She's the winner of four, count them, four Hugo Awards, and is the owner of Wizards Tower Press. Her non-fiction has appeared in a variety of venues, including Locus, SFWA Bulletin, Science Fiction Encyclopedia, Vector, Strange Horizons. Her fiction has appeared in a number of small press magazines and anthologies. Cheryl was a guest of honor at the 2012 Eurocon in Zagreb and the 2019 FinCon in, oh my lordy, I'm not going to pronounce that. So sorry. I've already done Spanish. I'm not going to go for that one. Finish. Sorry, Finnish. She was a keynote speaker at the World SF Conference at the University of Graz in 2018. And Cheryl's title for her talk today is Something in the Air. There's probably a music reference in there, but I will leave it standing. Okay, Cheryl, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Bienvenue à Montreal, where I am sort of semi-attending SMOFCon, the annual convention for convention runners. But this morning, I'm delighted to be able to talk to you. I'm also very grateful to Paul, to Kate, to Emma and Dimitra, everybody else involved in running the convention for inviting me to come and talk, and of course to all of you folks for being here to listen to me. And yes, my talk is called Something in the Air, and Paul is dead right. There is a music reference in there. The reference in particular is from a 1969 song by Thunderclap Newman. And the passage in the lyrics, I was thinking always, call out the instigators because there's something in the air. We've got to get together sooner or later because the revolution's here. So revolution, yes, when it changed, that's stuff that I'm going to be talking about. I could, of course, have taken the title from something else. We've got somewhat earlier here, 1964, Bob Dylan. And this is something that's become increasingly important to me as I've become older. I'm trying hard to live my life by this advice. So, come mothers and fathers throughout the land, don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changing. And lyrics like that, songs like that, would have been very much in the air when Joanna Russ was writing the story When It Changed. Indeed, there was a whole atmosphere back then of something was going on, that the world was going to change, things were going to be different in the future. When It Changed itself appeared as part of the now legendary anthology series Dangerous Visions. It was in the second volume, again Dangerous Visions, which was published in 1972. I'm not going to get into the whole story about last Dangerous Visions, although I do believe that it might finally see publication next year, which will be an interesting science fiction event. The story When It Changed itself won Nebula and was a finalist for the Hugo in the short story category that year. The anthology also included The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. Le Guin, which won a Hugo for novella. So it's clearly very successful. It's also of interest that Harlan Ellison was famous in those days for being a feminist ally. These days, of course, he's much more famous for having sexually assaulted Connie Willis while the two of them were presenting the Hugo Awards at a Worldcon a few years back. But Harlan did try back then. In particular, in 1978, Harlan was guest of honor at the Worldcon in Phoenix, and the whole debate around the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment was a hot topic in America at the time. Arizona was one of the states that had voted against, and Harlan, although he'd been asked to be guest of honor, was very much upset about having to go to Arizona. So he came to a deal with the con committee that they would rent him a recreational vehicle in California, and he could stock it up with food and drive to Phoenix, and then he would not have to spend any money in the state of Arizona and therefore not give taxes to the Arizona government. So yeah, change, people change, times change, things change, but there was an expectation of change at the time. Unfortunately, we are still having to protest this fucking shit. And this is part of what I want to talk about today. Are things changing? Have they changed? And if so, how do we know they've changed? And how can we ensure that any change is going to be lasting as opposed to temporary? Now, I want to acknowledge up front that there are many different axes of oppression that we could be looking at here. I'm not going to talk much about race and ethnicity or sexuality or disability or a whole range of other things. This conference is primarily about gender. Gender is a thing that I'm best able to talk about. And as you'll see when I start talking about the data, it's one of the things which is slightly easier to get information about. So if you were in the Lisa Yasuk talk yesterday, you will have heard Lisa talk about how there was a fabulous golden age for feminist science fiction back in the late 70s, early 80s. There was a whole lot of wonderful stuff being done, and there was a small amount of diversity in the people who were winning awards. I mean, there's lots of women I've put up here, but we've also got Samuel Delaney, Somtoz Chiracho, Octavia Butler, obviously. There were a bunch of people of color who were active in the field as well. It wasn't by any means representative, but there was a presence. And you'll also hear, I've heard Lisa talk about how cyberpunk came along and things appeared to go backwards a little bit. I think the publishers suddenly got the idea that science fiction was all about computers. Computers were only for men, therefore they should only buy books from male writers. Everybody gives an honourable mention to Pat Cadigan, partly because she's wonderful, and also because she did an amazing job of establishing herself as a cyberpunk writer back in that period. I think we can all agree that Bruce Sterling is a bit of an arse, but well, when I look at this sort of thing, I always say, is it true? Did that actually happen? Or is it something that that we just tell stories about? Now, of course, periods of backsliding do happen. Whoa, sorry about that. That's the telephone here in the room. I've got there the quote that is normally attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. About the arc of the moral universe being long and bending towards justice, but not necessarily being a straight line. I understand that that was originally coined by a 19th century preacher called Theodore Parker. Dr. King put it in quotes when he first used it, but it's become associated with him since. So we do expect periods of backsliding, and that eventually we're going to get to where we want to be, but we might have unfortunate periods along the way. Something else I'd like to consider in terms of sort of mathematical models, as it were, is the concept of catastrophe theory. This is something which became popular when we started talking about climate change and stuff like that. Now, catastrophe theory, of course, appeals to us as writers because it can herald sudden change, and the whole idea of the chosen one saving the world and everything coming right again is very much a sort of catastrophe theory view of how things happen. In the real world, of course, it doesn't always work in that way. Things can change gradually rather than suddenly. But the important point about catastrophe theory is that it postulates the existence of stable conditions and unstable conditions. Probably the best example of that is a spinning top. A top has two stable conditions: when it's actually spinning and when it's fallen over. Both of those are relatively stable, but there isn't a stable condition where it can be on it spinning and on its side. So, when we're looking at the state of the field, we might wonder whether there was a period of a stable equilibrium where men were dominant, and maybe we could get to a period of stable equilibrium where women are dominant. There are lots of lovely professional-looking examples of the catastrophe theory chart online, but I picked that image because it comes from the Science Museum in San Francisco, the Exploratorium. And given when it was actually produced, it's possible that it was drawn by Pat Murphy, because she did work there for quite a while. One final thing I want us to bear in mind is that our memory of how things happened in the past is not always terribly accurate. And just a little anecdote there, I was at a Worldcon Hugo ceremony a few years back. I think it was Helsinki, but it might have been Dublin. And after the ceremony, somebody said to me, "Wow, it's wonderful how we got so much diversity in the Hugos now. There wasn't any before 2014, and that London Worldcon just changed everything." Now, of course, all of my 4 Hugo wins were before 2014, and I don't think the person I was talking to quite appreciated that he was essentially accusing me of being a man. But there have been people who have had success in the field in the deep past, and we do tend to forget about them. So I want us to bear that in mind too. So the only way that we can actually get to the facts, I think, is if we have some data. And then perhaps the whole debate will be elementary. Who knows? Anyway, so when I was asked to do this talk, the first thing I thought of was an essay that I wrote for the British Science Fiction Association's Vector magazine back in January 2020. I think it's issue 269, but Kate has a link which I imagine will appear in the chat sometime soon. And the basis of the talk, of the essay, which I call "Decade That Women Won," is that the Hugos have moved from a position of largely male dominance through the experience of the Puppy War. You can see here that the total number of winners is less than 100% because there was no awards, into a period where women have completely dominated, where there were no men winners at all in the fiction awards. A very similar pattern can be seen in the finalists, and looking at finalists is often better data because you've got more people, so it gives you a better idea of what's going on. But we can see that there's a general downward trend in male finalists, with a little upward blip in the puppy period, and a general upward trend in the number of women. We can also see that there's a small but hopefully significant upward trend in the number of people identifying themselves as non-binary. So that's all well and good, and it made a nice story for my essay back in 2020. But obviously, revisiting it now, the first thing I had to ask was, has that trend continued? But before I get to that point, you shouldn't put up data like this without going into your assumptions. So here are mine. That data comes from the Written Fiction Awards, which comprise the novella, novelette, short story series, which is relatively new, graphic story, which is new but not quite that new, Lodestar, again very new, and Astounding, which used to be the Campbell. For the graphic story category, I've looked only at scriptwriters, because what we're looking at here is written fiction. Where there are multiple finalists, you get fractions of a point. So, for example, if Phil and Kaya Folio are the winners for graphic story, that's half a point for the men and half a point for the women. I've taken a policy decision that trans women are women and trans men are men. So if, for example, Charlie Jane Anders appears in the list of finalists, then she is listed under women, not separately as a trans woman. On the other hand, non-binary people are listed as non-binary. Now, obviously, that doesn't show the full extent of gender diversity in the Hugos, but I wanted to make that point at trans women and women. So how does that look in the more recent years? Well, we can see that in 2020, men made a small comeback, That's due largely to The Expanse, James S.A. Corey, which is a combination of Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham, won for Best Series. There's also half a point for the men because Max Gladstone was involved in writing This Is How We Lose the Time War. Other than that, it's all been women, and this year our first ever non-binary winner, openly identified as non-binary, Shelley Parker Chan. So that's all looking pretty good. Perhaps women are in charge. And if we look at the finalists as well, we can see a very similar story that the women continue to be in charge here, and the number of non-binary people is still small but increasing. So all well and good thus far. But how does it actually compare to the past? Is our memory of the past accurate or not? So I went back and looked at the past. In this particular case, I decided to look only at the 4 major fiction categories. So novel, novella, novelette, and short story. One of the reasons for that is that they existed, all of them existed throughout this period. And there's nothing new coming in, which is useful for having reliable data. And we can see here that there were 1 or 2 periods where men were totally dominant. Interestingly, Neuromancer was published in 1984. The following year, there was a female winner. Then there were 2 years without. But after that, things got back to a regular thing of about 1 woman out of 4 winning Hugos, apart from this odd little blip here in the middle of the 20s, which I'm not entirely sure what happened. So the idea that men achieved total dominance with cyberpunk, I think, is a little strange. Maybe for 2 years, but not this. It's also, of course, the women who are having success are not necessarily the same ones. So back here, we might see people like Joanna Russ and Rhonda McIntyre having success. Up here, it's more likely to be Connie Willis, Nancy Kress, or Lois McMaster Bujold. So that's that. There is 1 non-binary in there. That is Tiptree. And the reason I put Tiptree in there is because I don't know. It would be good if we had a separate word for gender where you don't actually know. And hat tip to Rachel Hartman, whose novel Shadow Scale includes a city where they do have a word for I don't know what your gender is. But as far as Tiptree is concerned, we can't ask Alice Sheldon. But there's something clearly pretty diverse going on. So I put Tiptree in the non-binary category. If we look at the finalists, then we see that the story is pretty much the same. It's largely male dominated all the way through, apart from a curious little period here, 92, 93, where it's just about equal. There's a few Tiptrees down here, but broadly speaking, we've got male dominance throughout this period, and therefore I think we can say that something happened towards the end of the 2010s. Now, just looking at the Hugos, of course, was not necessarily sufficient. There are other things that you can look at. So I thought I would do the same experiment with the World Fantasy Awards. And here the categories I have used are novel, novella, which is they sometimes call long fiction, short fiction or short story, and collection, because those are all written fiction categories. They all exist throughout the period, and they are all ones which can be easily associated with an individual. And we see here at the beginning of the World Fantasy Awards, there was a lot of male dominance. This is Ursula Le Guin, and here we have a shared win for Ellen Kushner and a win for Pat Murphy, and then a whole lot of only men. And then we get to something that's a little bit more like the Hugos, with some women, occasionally equity. And then towards the end of our period, we start to see women dominating, and we get a couple of non-binary wins. Those are Shale Polk and Case and Calendar. So fairly much a similar story. Let's take a look now at the finalists. Right, and we can see here the finalists, same sort of story, men on a downward trend, women on an upward trend, but the upward trend for women is actually beginning before the period of the puppy war. So I think I'm slightly less inclined to believe in a sudden change as a result of the puppies. You look here, for example, we've got women dominating in 2011. Got a couple of non-binaries down here as well. Those are Billy Martin. Billy, of course, was living as a woman at the time, was assumed to be a woman writer. I haven't had a chance to talk to Billy about how he wants that period to be understood, so I've stuck that in as non-binary, meaning don't know. So yeah, we've got some data, and the data seems to suggest that we have entered a period of female dominance in science fiction, major science fiction awards, that something has actually changed. So are we into a new equilibrium? Is this going to be a permanent state of affairs? I'm not totally convinced that this is entirely a result of the puppies. I think that the puppy war might have been, to some extent, a reaction to people seeing that a change was happening. And I think there's probably something deeper going on. And when we worry about whether we could flip back again, then I think we need to look at those deeper causes. And those sorts of things are the sorts of things that Joanna Russ wrote about in the book, How to Suppress Women's Writing. There's a whole bunch of stuff about the structure of the industry, the locus of power in the industry, and so on and so forth. So that's what I want to look at in the next part of the talk. And here I'm going to be dependent on some data collected by my friend and colleague, Professor Farah Mendelsohn. Farah gave a talk at ICFA and at EasterCon entitled Science Fiction in the Rainbow Age. The term Rainbow Age is credited to the author A.C. Greenblatt. And this is going to be, I think, a paper in the Journal for the Fantastic and the Arts sometime soon. But you all know how academic publishing goes. It could take a little while. And I'm very grateful to Farah for giving me a pre-release copy of the paper so I could get all the data. So one of the areas in which who is dominant in the field is established is big anthologies. These are supposed to be collections of all of the best science fiction short stories in the field through history. And we can see that the early ones were edited by men, and the number of stories by women is quite low. Once we start to get women involved, the number of women goes up. Interestingly, with the two Vandermeer fantasy anthologies, the classic fantasy has a much lower proportion of women than the modern fantasy. And that might be telling us something about who was getting published at the time, as opposed to who was writing good stories. I think also of interest was this anecdote that Farah provided in the paper. She says, Brian Atterbury approached me at ICFA to explain that he and Ursula Le Guin had to fight for such a high percentage of female authors, that's this 31.2%, at one point being accused of making them up. So, sexism was clearly alive and well in the industry in 1993. Another way in which the nature of the field can be established and who is dominant is through academic histories of the field. And here we have a bunch that were written in the 20th century. They are all written by men. All of them have a very low proportion of women in them, even the one by Farah's husband, Edward James. Very much the 20th century view of academics was that men wrote histories of science fiction and men wrote largely about male writers, and that science fiction was a male field. If we look at what's happened in the 21st century, the situation is very different. The books by men have a much greater proportion of women in them. And Cheryl Vint, bless her, is doing sterling work in producing histories of science fiction, which contain large numbers of men once in collaboration with Mark Bald, and 2 books of her own. So here we've got the presence of a female academic, raising the profile of female writers in the field. Farah notes in her paper, the profile of PhD students has changed considerably in the past decade. Scholars are more likely to come from fandom, to be female, and to be people of colour. And this is you folks out there. You folks are in charge of who gets to be remembered in the field now. So hopefully you are all going to write about wonderful women writers and also writers of a range of other genders. Thank you for the hearts, whoever it was that put those up. So yes, control of the process. This is essentially what How to Suppress Women's Writing is all about, because if you're not in control of the process, then it's very easy for your work to be erased and forgotten. So who decides what's published, who writes reviews, who runs the professional bodies, who volunteers? It's all important. And I've got a quote here from Russ in How to Suppress Women's Writing, where she says, figures are hard to come by, but in several contemporary professional associations of writers, women are certainly underrepresented. In 1974, the female membership of the Science Fiction Writers of America was 18% by my computation. Now, I don't know what the female membership of SFWA is these days, but I rather suspect it is a lot higher than 18%. Whenever I see anything being done by SFWA, it's almost always women who are doing it. And people like Mary Robinette Kowal have done some amazing work transforming that organization. Mainstream publishers, of course, are still largely run by men and by accountants and by people who don't seem to know anything about writing books or what they're publishing, based on that recent trial that they had with the random puffin thing. But we do have a lot of small presses, and many of those small presses, like mine, are run by women. So maybe there's some progress being made there. When I started writing reviews back several decades ago, most of them were being done by men, and all the awards were being won by Dave Langford. But nowadays we have BookTube, we have BookTok, there are an enormous number of women sharing their opinions about science fiction and fantasy on the internet, so much so that I've completely lost track of what's going on. But it's amazing what you can find out there. Volunteers is a slightly different matter. Science fiction conventions, as we know them, are generally run by volunteers, and volunteering is a thing that can only be done by people who have time and money. If you've got a demanding job, if you're trying to raise a family, if you're a carer for an elderly relative, or simply if you don't have any money, you can't go off to these science fiction conventions and volunteer to help to run them. So there's very much an issue there of conventions are in the control of people often who are older and who have a fair amount of resources. Not a lot that we can do about that in practice, unless we want to change the basis on which conventions are run. But you can see that sort of thing happening. For example, at this year's Worldcon, there was a whole bunch of proposed amendments to the Hugo Award rules brought forward by a committee of volunteers who were clearly out of touch, even with the people who go to the business meeting, because most of them were dismissed. And it's not just in our field that this sort of thing happens. In the UK recently, we've seen some very determined attempts at far-right entryism into national organisations. For the past couple of years, the National Trust has been under siege from people who want to take it over, to stop the Trust from being involved in conservation efforts, to stop the Trust from highlighting the role of owners of stately homes in the slave trade, and to stop the Trust from being involved in pride events and anything else involving LGBT plus people. We've also seen this year an attempt by transphobic authors to take over the Society of Authors. Now, both of these things have been repulsed, although with the National Trust, I think it was really quite a close run thing these days, this year, because so many people are apathetic about it. The voting in the Society of Authors was rather more clear cut, But nevertheless, the transphobic rebels who were trying to take over it had the support pretty much of all of the national media outlets, which is a bit worrying. And I noticed that their number included the science fiction author Richard Morgan, in addition to the well-known author of books about boy wizards. I remember when I first reviewed Altered Carbon, I commented that the author seemed to have an unhealthy obsession with women's breasts. And it's a strange thing for Richard to have done, to have become this supposed champion of women's rights, to make up for that. But, you know, people change. Very odd. Now, another issue that we might have to deal with is the question of what is a woman. Not me, allegedly. And for this talk, I am proudly wearing my t-shirt, which says, "Huge problem to a sane world." That is quoting the British journalist Helen Joyce, who believes that my mere existence means that the world has gone mad. And in the view of people like Joyce, many of you folks are not women either. Occasionally, the so-called gender critical faction on social media has a little rant about people they don't like. And last week, one of them was having a rant about people who'd done trans awareness training for the police. I happen to have done that in the past. And they described me as someone who has a long history of denigrating women. Hopefully that's not true. I think some of you have known me for quite a while. But of course, when they say women, they don't mean you. They don't mean people with XX chromosomes. They don't mean people who've given birth. They mean people like themselves. Anybody who doesn't agree with their view doesn't count as a woman in their strange little world. There's so much gatekeeping that goes on. And Joanna Russ understood this in the most recent edition of How to Suppress Women's Writing. There's a foreword by Jessa Crispin in which she talks about how a fragile self will need to define itself against an other, and how Russ understood this, and how this causes all sorts of political problems within feminism. And we can see this playing out very much at the moment in current world politics. There are still some good journalists at the BBC. In particular, there's a woman called Mariana Spring, who specialises in looking at online hate movements and how they operate. And for the recent American midterm elections, she did a little experiment where she created some social media profiles for typical voters of various types, and she then monitored them to see the sort of propaganda that would be fed to them by the far right. Now, one of the people in her data set was a woman that she called Brittany, who was white, middle-aged, middle class, a mother, and Republican voting. She didn't actually say that Brittany was a transphobe, but it was pretty clear from the description that she was the sort of person who would be vulnerable to being radicalized into anti-trans movements. And when the results of the experiment came through, Mariana was surprised to find that by far the largest amount of misinformation that was directed by far-right politicians at the voters went to people like Brittany. So they are deliberately targeting middle-aged, middle-class white women. And not only were they targeting them with misinformation, they were also targeting them with misogyny. The number of misogynist posts that women like Brittany were receiving went up dramatically during the election period. And it's pretty clear that what is going on here is an attempt to frighten white women into voting for a powerful man to protect them. And the other thing I want to note here is that back in 2019, I was fortunate to attend a convention called Transversal Transfeminisms, which took place at the University of Roehampton in London. It is the first and so far the only academic conference I've ever been to where we had to have security guards because the conference had received credible threats through online from anti-trans people. So that was an interesting experience. But one of the other speakers there was from Hungary. Is a woman called Erzsébet Barat, who had been active in feminism for many, many decades. And she was distraught at the way in which the ideals of feminism were being twisted in Hungary under the Orban government. She told us that young feminists in her country were stating that feminism was all about having babies. It was all about looking after your children. It was all about supporting your man while he went out to have a career. And the line that was being pushed was that ideas of gender equality were an evil Western import that needed to be resisted. Feminism was about being true to the biological differences of women and women knowing their place in society. And you know, this is the sort of thing that is being pushed in various parts of Europe as a means of undermining what we know as feminism. So there's a lot that we need to be careful about here. And when we see women winning awards, we have to be a little suspicious and say, are those people sharing our ideals about feminism, or are they perhaps being put up on a pedestal? Because, you know, we've seen people like Liz Truss, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Just having a woman in a position of power is not necessarily a good thing. Now, as far as I know, all the women winning awards in the science fiction community are fabulous, good intersectional feminists, but I'm still slightly wary and keeping an eye open on what's happening. And just to end, there is something that I am actually worried about, and that's the concept of women's work. When I do trans awareness training for clients, I talk about how society has these ideas of jobs for boys and jobs for girls. There are things that men are naturally suited for, things that women are naturally suited for. And we know that we argue against this through things like Rosie the Riveter, for example. But also I talk about the example of typing and computer programming. When the typewriter was first invented, it was a flash new piece of technology. It was so sophisticated that only men were capable of using it. Women were deemed to be too fluffy-brained to get their heads around a typewriter. But it wasn't too long before we got to a world where men had big ideas and women put them down on paper through the medium of the typewriter. The typing pool was invented. And then computers started to come along, and programming computers involved typing to make your punch cards, your programs. And so the job of programming was given to the typing pool, and lots of women became computer programmers. And when I joined the IT industry back in the early 1980s, there were still lots of women involved in it. You know, women who'd had quite long careers. But as time went on and as computer programming became a very well-paid job, women have been pushed out, and now we have young men saying that women are too fluffy-brained to write software, and the industry has to be the sole preserve of men. Now, all of this, of course, is socially constructed nonsense, but we do have these ideas of jobs for men and jobs for women, and women's work is generally less paid and less secure than men's work. And we've seen this with the pandemic, that the people losing their jobs are largely women. And what worries me about the sudden dominance of women in the science fiction community is that perhaps writing has become women's work. But now that it's no longer possible for being an author to be a job for life, something that can give you a career, maybe some men are abandoning being authors and going off to do other things that are better paid, leaving the field open to women. I don't know whether there's any evidence for that. I haven't had time to look for it, but it is something I'm a little concerned about. So the struggle goes on, and I want to leave you with a thought from Ursula Le Guin. You cannot buy the revolution, you cannot make the revolution, you can only be the revolution. It's in your spirit, or it is nowhere. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you. We've got a good 20 minutes or so for questions. If people would like to put questions into the chat or raise your hand, please do so. We have had we've had a couple of messages from Farah Mendelssohn. Edward wasn't my husband at the time. I might have given him more grief. But DragonCon though has no childcare. So if you look around, you realize it's not young because it attracts young people. It's young because it's quite hostile to parents. So there's an interesting issues around exclusivity going on there. Do we have any questions that people would like to pose to Cheryl at all, or anything like that? Otherwise, I'll have to think of something quickly. Oh, we do. Kate, thank you. Kate asks, can you talk about the differences of writing science fiction versus fan history? So differences between writing science fiction history as opposed to fan history.
Well, fan history is a very interesting concept, and it's one I think that Farah addresses in the paper. So I really urge you to go and read that if you can do so, or I see from the chat that the talk is available online. What people mean by the term fan history is quite contested, in that there is still a group of people within science fiction fandom who believe that fan history is the history of the type of fans who were about in the 1940s, 1950s, going forward into the future. You know, the term true fan, for example, will get bandied about, and that fan history as a topic is only about true fans, not about fake fans. And fake fans, of course, include a lot of women. So what we actually need is proper fan history, which I'm sure that a few of you listening today are actually doing, which looks at the whole of the field and you know, the whole fanfic thing, and booktube and BookTok and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot to be done, I think, in the history of the multiple fandoms that swirl around our community.
Fantastic. I'm just going to see if I can okay, that's good. Yeah, that's good. So okay, so I've just closed screen share. So yes, fantastic. Thank you. There's a question from Sir Martin asks, what worries me is that women are winning more awards, but that might have no correlation with sales. And she then qualifies it by saying, I mean that sales are possibly still dominated by men's science fiction. And so asks, what's your view on this?
Again, that's not something that I have data on, but it's something I think that people should be researching. It's all again to do with this question of who controls the process. And in this particular case, the process is largely that of whose books get into the major stores. And I think we've seen that very clearly with the recent law case, that the people who run the big publishers are only actually interested in bestsellers. They don't care at all about all of the mid-list writers that they've got, unless those people then suddenly blossom and become bestsellers. As far as they're concerned, most of their authors are disposable. And you know, the whole thing about who gets into shops is that you can pay. I mean, if you look at W.H. Smith's in the UK, for example, they have a top 100 bestsellers book rack, and publishers pay to have their books posted at particular positions in that rack. There's known prices for being at different levels in the top 100. So the whole thing is complete nonsense. And you know, I think what we need to do is do our best to promote the award-winning books, and obviously to go out and buy them. I see Farah's got a comment as well. One big issue is that shops and libraries curate everyone, but write men off the shelves. So we need to push. Andrew Butler, who has vested interest in this, says that Clarke Award wins do have an impact on sales. And I'm absolutely delighted that Deep Wheel Arcadia has had a reprint, because it is a wonderful book. So well done, Josie Giles, for that. Yeah, so the Clarke does have a certain amount of impact, and I think that's down to the work that Tom has done in promoting it. I think Hugo wins, to a small extent, do have an impact on sales, but most other science fiction awards, anecdotally at least, don't have any impact on sales, which is, you know, a bit sad.
Fantastic. Yeah, I must admit, I've got a review of Deep Wheel Arcadia coming out in PN Review at the start of next year. So I think the role of viewers, which leads to the next question again from Kate. Kate asks, can you talk about your work as an editor and what you're looking forward to in the future of publishing?
Well, first of all, I think I should say that as far as Wizard's Tower is concerned, I am not an editor, I'm the publisher. When it comes to editing books, I hire people in to do that, or more often, in fact, my authors hire people that they know in to do that, because the whole ecosystem of small presses is very much a case of people being comfortable with what they're doing. Because I publish largely people who already have a career, they know people in the field whom they're comfortable having editing their books. So I don't have much to do with that. But as a publisher, the purpose of Wizard's Tower initially was quite backward looking, in that when I started the company 12 years ago now, I think, we were going through this period where mainstream publishers were suddenly dropping all of their mid-list writers and moving into the current paradigm where they assign people on for 2 or 3 books, and if they don't become bestsellers in that time, they drop them and sign up somebody new. So a lot of my friends who were mid-list writers were suddenly finding themselves dropped by publishers and their books going out of print. And at the same time, ebooks had just become a thing, and I decided that I would use my software skills to produce ebooks of books by my friends that had gone out of print. So that was very much a backward-looking view of things. And that's what Wizard's Tower does largely. I mean, when I got involved with the local community in Bristol and BristolCon, we did do some anthologies of new writers, which was a nice thing to be able to do. But it's not big sales by any means. I mean, the stuff that sells well is stuff by people like Juliet McKenna and Chas Brenchley and Leiden Morehouse and so on, who already have an established fan base. I would love to do new and exciting stuff, but I'm not sure that I personally have the skills to do that job.
Demetrius mentioned that they'll be having Josie Giles as a guest on the AHRC funded product network that she's running with Esther McCollum Stewart, and she's also put the link into the chat there. Kate refers to Juliet McKenna's Green Man series. Do we have any other questions for Cheryl? Because we got a bit of time left. Are there any other questions that people might want to raise? Let's pause there for a second. Kate Coe says no questions, just enthusiasm and love, which is fantastic. Lovely. Okay, look, if we don't have more questions, then and lots of claps, hearts going up, I think we should definitely applaud Cheryl, and I think we can break and have a slightly longer lunch break, which I think is good. And I think Cheryl, who's beaming in from very, very early in Canada, I think she needs to get some breakfast. Thank you so much for everybody. Thank you, and we'll be back again at 2 o'clock. Okay, at UK time.
Yeah. No, sadly, there's no poutine in the con suite, and we don't have time to go out and get it because I want to be back to listen to the next session. But there are croissant and pain au chocolat, so breakfast time here.
Thank you so much again. Okay, back in just under an hour. Thank you now. Bye now.
Thanks, folks.